The sun wasn't even up yet when I found 2 trucks with flashing red and blue lights blocking my driveway, and 3 men in knockoff uniforms telling me I couldn't leave until I paid a $79 community violation fee. One of them even flashed a plastic-looking badge and called himself Sergeant. I just stared at them, stunned, not because I was scared, but because they had no clue who they were messing with. I'm the actual chief of police. Asterisk, I've spent the last 24 years in law enforcement, working my way up from beat cop to detective, then captain, and eventually chief of police for our city. I've dealt with cartel busts, hostage situations, and undercover operations that made my blood run cold. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the absolute madness of dealing with a homeowners association run by overzealous nobodies with a taste for power. My wife and I moved into this neighborhood looking for peace and quiet. What we found was a powder keg waiting to blow, all over a $79 parking fine. That was early spring when we moved into the new place. The trees were just starting to bloom, birds chirped in the mornings, and the street looked like something off a real estate postcard. It was a quiet cul-de-sac just outside city limits, which meant I could still get to the precinct in under 20 minutes but escape the noise when I was off duty. My wife, Melissa, loved the kitchen, and the backyard had enough space for the dog and our future plans. Maybe a small garden, maybe kids. Everything looked perfect. But it only took 1 week before the first letter showed up in our mailbox. At first, I didn't think much of it. The envelope was crisp white, the HOA logo printed neatly in the corner, and inside was a friendly courtesy notice reminding me that trash bins needed to be removed from the curb by 6 p.m. on collection date. No problem, I thought. We'd brought ours in around 7:30, so they were technically right. I didn't even mention it to Melissa, figured it was just the kind of nitpicky thing these suburban groups likes to do. We were the new folks. After all, maybe it was just a way to make sure we knew the rules. Then came the second letter. This time the envelope was marked warning notice, second violation. Apparently, I'd failed to repaint the mailbox post, which showed visible signs of rust and wear. That made me chuckle. I'd seen rusted out Camaros on cinder blocks in other parts of town, and they were worried about my mailbox. Still, I didn't want trouble, so I spent a Saturday afternoon sanding it down and giving it to coats of black enamel paint. Melissa teased me the whole time, calling me Officer Mailbox, but it felt good to check it off and move on. The third letter was different. It came in a bright red envelope, like they wanted to make sure I couldn't miss it. Inside was a formal citation for a parking violation, along with a fine of $79. Apparently, I'd broken the rules by leaving my vehicle, my department-issued cruiser, parked in my driveway overnight. The HOA cited some clause about non-residential or fleet vehicles, affecting neighborhood aesthetics, and warned that future violations would result in towing. I stood there in the kitchen holding the letter, speechless. Melissa read it over my shoulder. "You've got to be kidding," she said. "They're really fining you for parking your own work car in our driveway. I guess they don't like the sight of a police cruiser on their precious block." I muttered, already annoyed. Now, here's the thing. I understand rules. I live by them, enforce them. But rules should make sense. They should protect people, not harass them. And what this HOA was doing felt less like keeping the neighborhood clean and more like policing with a clipboard and a superiority complex. Still, I didn't want to escalate things over $79. I figured I'd talk to them, clear it up. Maybe they didn't realize I lived here full-time, or maybe the rule was being misinterpreted. I didn't even cash my first paycheck from the news station yet, and I was already being hit with petty nonsense, so I called the number on the citation. A woman answered, cheerful but robotic, and introduced herself as Deborah, community compliance specialist. I explained the situation calmly, told her I was the homeowner, that the vehicle in question was mine, and that I was chief of police.
"Oh, yes,"
she said, sounding like she'd just bitten into something sour. "We've had a few complaints about the cruiser. Some residents say it makes them feel unsafe." I blinked. "They feel unsafe seeing a police vehicle in a neighborhood?" "Well, sir, it gives the impression that there's criminal activity in the area." I laughed. "Lady, the only crime happening here is this fine." She didn't find that funny. "You have the right to appeal the citation by attending the next HOA board meeting," she said curtly. "But in the meantime, the fine stands. Please remit payment within 10 business days." I hung up without saying goodbye. That weekend I attended the HOA meeting. It was held at the local library in a cramped community room that smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. The board sat at the front like royalty, 5 people who looked like they'd never worked a 12-hour shift in their lives. Ronald was the president, a balding man in a tan blazer who loved the sound of his own voice. He gave a long-winded introduction about preserving community values before finally opening the floor. I stood up and introduced myself. "The police cruiser you find me for belongs to me. I'm your new neighbor, the one at the corner lot, and I'm also the chief of police. That vehicle is part of my job. I'd appreciate it if this board reconsidered its position on the fine." Whispers spread across the room. A few residents looked surprised, even supportive, but Ronald didn't blink. "Our rules apply to everyone equally," he said, lips tight. "We can't make exceptions, even for law enforcement." You already do, I replied. I've seen 3 pickup trucks parked on lawns, a boat in someone's driveway, and Christmas lights still up in March. None of those got fined. Ronald narrowed his eyes. You're welcome to file a report. But unless you pay your fine, further penalties will apply. I could feel the heat rising in my neck. I wanted to tell them exactly what I thought of their power trip, but I kept my cool. You're not running a government here, I said calmly. You're not above the law. Ronald gave me a tight smile. Good thing you know the law. Then, I left without another word. I didn't pay the fine. I didn't go to war with them either, not yet. But I started watching, quietly, observing how they operated, how they enforced their so-called community standards. I talked to other neighbors, heard stories about outrageous fines, sudden rule changes, and threats of lien filings over landscaping choices. It wasn't just me. They were targeting people left and right, mostly the quiet ones, the elderly, the single moms, people they didn't think would fight back. And then, one morning about 2 weeks after the meeting, I opened my front door to find 2 black pickup trucks blocking my driveway. Their hazard lights blinked. 3 men stood nearby in dark polo shirts and cargo pants, one holding a clipboard, another wearing a shiny fake badge. One stepped forward, arm raised. Sir, you are currently restricted from leaving the premises until a matter of unpaid fees is resolved. I stared at them, jaw tight, heart pounding, not with fear, but with fury. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and this was war. There are few things more surreal than standing in your front yard, dressed for work, badge clipped to your belt, coffee steaming in your hand, only to be told by 3 strangers in cheap polos that you're not allowed to leave your own property. At 6:02 a.m., with the sun just starting to warm the sidewalk, that's exactly what was happening to me. And these guys weren't just making empty threats. They'd physically boxed me in with 2 trucks and were quoting what they called enforcement protocol. The sad part, they actually believed they had the authority to do this, sir. The one in front barked again. You're under temporary restriction due to non-payment of a community fee. This is your second notice of non-compliance. If you continue to resist, we'll be forced to escalate. He wasn't even trying to sound reasonable anymore. He sounded like someone who watched too many reruns of cop shows and thought authority came from a clipboard and a matching uniform. The fake badge around his neck swung when he moved. It looked like it came from a costume store, and his 2 backup officers were shifting awkwardly behind him, clearly unsure if they'd signed up for something legal or just embarrassing. I took one slow step forward and looked him in the eye. Do you know who I am? He blinked. You're the homeowner who refused to comply. I didn't smile. I didn't raise my voice. I just reached slowly to my belt and pulled out my actual badge, the gold-plated city-issued one with my name etched right into it. I held it up to eye level. I'm Chief Daniel Cole. I oversee every law enforcement operation in this city. You're blocking a sworn officer of the law from reporting for duty. That's obstruction. You're impersonating law enforcement. That's a crime. The guy paused just a beat, but enough for me to know the badge shook him. He looked back at his friends. One of them, the youngest, was already fidgeting like he wanted to run. The leader, though, tried to puff himself up again. We were authorized by the HOA to enforce penalties on delinquent accounts, he said, pointing at his clipboard like it was the Constitution. Authorized by a group of retired dentists and realtors, I snapped. You're not law enforcement. You're not even licensed security. You're now on private property, detaining me without legal authority. I'm giving you one last warning. Move your vehicles, walk away, or I'll call in an official unit and start making arrests. The air got still. No more bravado now. Just 3 guys realizing they'd crossed a line they couldn't defend. And yet, incredibly, the man didn't move. You can't use your position to intimidate us, he said, voice shaky but stubborn. This isn't about you being a cop. It's about community standards. The board has the right. I walked past him mid-sentence, not even bothering to answer. I stepped back into my house, set my coffee down on the counter and called dispatch. Cole, here. I need a unit to my address. Immediate response. 3 individuals impersonating law enforcement, blocking egress from my driveway, possibly unlawful detainment. The dispatcher's voice turned alert instantly. Understood, Chief. ETA, 6 minutes. I returned outside and stood silently at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed. The 3 men looked increasingly nervous now. One tried to make a phone call, but his hand was shaking. I didn't say anything else. I just waited, like I'd waited during stakeouts, like I'd waited outside barricadeddoors.com/focused, letting the weight of silence do the work. Exactly 5 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires on asphalt and saw the 2 squad cars glide down the road. No sirens, just lights flickering low. They pulled in with the kind of controlled presence that sends a message. 2 officers stepped out, uniformed, fully armed, calm but serious. They knew exactly what was going on. Morning. Chief Officer Dunn greeted me as he approached. Looks like we've got a situation here. These 3 gentlemen are detaining me on my own property over a private HOA fine, I said clearly, in front of everyone. They're impersonating officers and refusing to leave when asked. I need you to take statements, ID them, and check for any prior records. Dunn nodded and gestured to his partner. The fake enforcers didn't try to run. They just stood there, red-faced, while the real officers separated them and began asking questions. I could hear snippets. Who told you to do this? Are you licensed? What's this badge made of? And none of the answers seemed to be helping their case. It wasn't long before one of the officers walked over to me holding a driver's license. Chief, the guy in the Polo SGT. Jeff, he's got a suspended license and an open citation for trespassing from 2 years ago. Figures, I muttered. And the other two, no security licenses, no certifications. One's not even a resident here. That surprised me. Then what's he doing here? Apparently, they found him on Facebook. He's an old buddy of Ronald, the HOA president. Of course, that as the enforcers were questioned, a familiar figure strutted down the street toward us, Ronald himself, wearing his usual smug expression and a buttoned blazer that didn't quite fit his stomach. He looked at the patrol cars, then at me, and gave a tight-lipped smile like this was all some misunderstanding. Chief Cole, he said, hands open as if he were calming a child. Let's not overreact. These gentlemen were simply assisting with community compliance. There's no need to escalate things further. They blocked my driveway, I replied flatly, and pretended to be law enforcement. They were instructed to prevent repeat violations, Ronald countered. We've had ongoing issues with you refusing to follow neighborhood policies. This could have been avoided if you had simply paid the fine. And I told you already, I snapped. I don't answer to your little clubhouse rules. I answer to the law. And these men just broke it. Ronald stepped back, clearly rattled by the attention now gathering. Neighbors were peeking out windows. A few had come out onto their lawns, whispering to each other, filming with their phones. The HOA president wasn't used to this kind of spotlight. I'd be happy to take this up with the board, he said quickly, but surely you wouldn't arrest your own neighbors. They're not my neighbors, I said. They're trespassers. And as far as I can tell, you orchestrated the entire stunt. If I dig further and find your name on any instruction order to block that driveway, you'll be the next one in cuffs. He paled. For a second, he looked like he might argue, but instead, he turned and walked away. I almost laughed. The 3 officers were cited on the spot charges pending for impersonation, trespassing, and obstruction. No arrests today, but that was coming later once the full case file was prepared. They left quietly, escorted by my officers, heads hung low. The trucks were towed. The street was cleared. I stood there, alone now, watching the patrol cars drive off. My coffee had long since gone cold, but I didn't care. I felt something colder like the opening shot in a long battle had just been fired, and I knew exactly how to win the war. Because now it wasn't just about a fine, it was about principle. About people who thought they could manipulate power and hide behind fake authority. About how far I was willing to go to protect my home, my wife, and my neighbors from a bunch of petty tyrants with clipboards. 3 days after the driveway incident, the sun rose over the cul-de-sac like nothing had happened. The birds chirped, sprinklers clicked on, and the usual joggers made their way past freshly mowed lawns. But underneath that calm suburban surface, everything had changed. The fake security team had been exposed, their phony authority dismantled, and Ronald, the smug HOA president, had retreated back into his house like a wounded dog. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. You don't get to humiliate a sitting chief of police on his own property and walk away clean. Not only had they tried to detain me illegally, but they'd weaponized their little HOA charter to harass not just me, but plenty of other residents. I'd started gathering complaints quietly at first just by chatting with neighbors on my evening walks. What I learned made my blood boil. Mrs. Hillman across the street, a sweet retired teacher, had been fined $300 for unauthorized potted plants because she placed succulents on her porch that weren't approved colors. A young couple down the block had a newborn and got fined twice for visible laundry because their baby's onesies were drying on a back patio clothesline. One man even told me he was threatened with a lien on his home over excessive garage use, whatever that meant. None of these so-called violations had any legal weight, but the HOA counted on one thing: fear. People didn't want to be dragged into disputes. They didn't want to deal with the headache of lawyers, letters, or angry neighbors, so they paid up. And Ronald, he fed off that power. The guy probably thought he was some kind of local king, that it was time to knock over the chessboard. The first thing I did was dig. Luckily, I know how to dig better than most. With a few phone calls, I pulled records from the state's Department of Consumer Affairs. None of the security personnel the HOA had used were registered. Not only was the board in violation of state security laws, they were also exposing residents to massive liability. If anything ever went wrong during one of their enforcement actions, one lawsuit could cripple the entire association. Next, I pulled the HOA's own charter and bylaws, public documents they were required to file with the county. And right there, buried in a poorly worded section, was gold. The HOA board had overstepped their authority. By creating and deploying security enforcement, they had rewritten community rules without a community vote. That alone was grounds for removal. I also contacted an attorney friend, Lisa, who owed me a favor. She specialized in HOA law. and after looking over the documents, she confirmed what I suspected. The board had not only broken state code, but potentially committed fraud by issuing fines and threats without proper legal support. "You've got a slam dunk," she told me. "You want to go public with this?" "Oh, I plan to," I said, already drafting my next move. I started by printing flyers, nothing dramatic, just factual.com, and to the point. HOA board operating outside legal authority. Know your rights before you pay another fine. I included a simple breakdown of the violations, a QR code linking to public records, and a note that a formal complaint was being filed with the county housing authority. I delivered them myself, slipping one into every mailbox on the street, including Ronald's. Then I filed the complaint, not just with the housing authority, but also with the city council, the Department of Consumer Protection, and the state licensing bureau. I attached body cam footage from the day of the driveway standoff. The video clearly showed the fake badge, the blockade, and the threats. I also submitted signed witness statements from other residents. I made sure everything was airtight. By the end of the week, Ronald called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, held once again in the community library room. This time it was packed. Over 40 residents showed up angry, confused, some holding copies of the flyer I distributed. The moment Ronald stepped up to the podium, the room went quiet. He tried to speak with his usual arrogance, but the murmurs were already building. "I know there's been some misunderstanding regarding recent enforcement measures." He started misunderstanding. Someone shouted, "You had fake cops block a man's driveway." "Yeah, and you fined me $50 because my kid drew chalk on the sidewalk," yelled another. Ronald held up his hands like a traffic cop trying to stop a highway pileup. "Please, let's be civil. This board has always acted in the best interest of the community." That's when I stood up. Acting in the best interest of the community doesn't involve impersonating officers or issuing illegal fines, I said. The room went silent again. "I've submitted formal complaints to the city and the state. Your use of unauthorized security, your violations of your own bylaws, and your threats of liens and legal action are now being investigated." Ronald turned red. "You have no authority over this board, Mr. Cole." "Actually," I said, pulling a paper from my folder, "you might want to read this. According to Section 4.2 of your own charter, any board member can be removed by a 2/3 majority vote of attending homeowners, and given the turnout here tonight, I think we meet the threshold." Gasps rippled through the room. People looked at each other, whispering. Ronald's eyes scanned the crowd like he was searching for a lifeboat. I continued, "So let's vote. Anyone in favor of removing the current HOA board, raise your hand." It was like a tidal wave. Hands shot up across the room. People who had been silent for years were suddenly emboldened. The room practically glowed with the energy of people taking back control. Ronald looked stunned. The secretary looked like she might cry. "That's well over 2/3, I said. "The board is dissolved pending investigation." I stepped aside. The crowd erupted in applause. By the next morning, word had spread. Local news picked up the story. A segment ran with the headline, "HOA overreach backfires. Police chief ousts rogue board." Reporters parked on our street for interviews. I declined most of them, but I did give one brief statement. Rules are only as good as the people who enforce them. And when those people abuse their power, it's up to the rest of us to stand up. The interim HOA committee was made up of 5 new residents, people who actually listened. They reviewed all pending fines and wiped out most of them, including mine. They ended the ridiculous appearance patrols and dissolved the security group permanently. Peace returned to our street, not because someone with a badge cracked down, but because truth and community won out over ego and intimidation. Still, I kept the original $79 citation. I had it framed in my office, just under my oath of service. A reminder that sometimes justice doesn't start with a crime. Sometimes it starts with a fine. I should have known Ronald wouldn't go down without a fight. People like him, those who've tasted even the smallest crumb of control, never accept defeat with grace. But I wasn't expecting what came next, because Ronald didn't act alone. He had someone behind the scenes, whispering poison into his ear the whole time. Her name was Karen Whitaker, and if Ronald was the face of our HOA, Karen was the brain. Or maybe the venom. She lived 3 houses down from me, in a 2-story colonial with fake ivy growing up the columns. You couldn't miss her. Was painfully perfect. Plastic deer in the flower beds, a color-coded garden, a no trespassing private security sign posted beside a hand-painted welcome rock. It was like someone tried to turn Pinterest into a dictatorship. And Karen ran her house the same way she ran the board, from behind closed doors, with fake smiles and real threats. I'd seen her at the meetings, always seated just behind Ronald, scribbling notes furiously while whispering in his ear between motions. She never officially held a title, but she was the shadow leader of the HOA, and now, with the board dissolved and Ronald ousted, she had everything to lose. It didn't take long for the retaliation to begin. The first strike was subtle, a complaint, filed anonymously to Internal Affairs alleging that I'd abused my power as chief of police to intimidate community leaders. It was pure nonsense, of course. The officers who responded to the driveway incident had filed full reports. Everything was documented. Still, IA was required to follow protocol. I was called in for a formal review. "You're not in trouble," the investigator assured me, "but we have to close this out the right way." I sat in a windowless room for nearly 2 hours answering questions. They asked whether I had used my badge to threaten civilians, whether I had influenced officers to make arrests for personal gain, whether I had manipulated my position for private property disputes. I answered everything clearly, calmly, confidently. When the review concluded, the investigator leaned back and said, "You handled it by the book. We're closing it out as unfounded. But whoever filed this wanted to stir the pot, no doubt about that. I didn't have to dig far to find the source." One of my officers, who lived a few blocks away, tipped me off that Karen had been making rounds gathering signatures, telling neighbors I was dangerous, vindictive, and abusing power. She'd even gone as far as to suggest I had a vendetta against the HOA and she was looking into pressing charges. It was laughable if it wasn't so calculated. Then came the second strike. Anonymous complaints to city code enforcement. Within a week, I received 3 separate notices. My fence was too high by HOA standards, even though it had passed inspection when we moved in. My police cruiser was leaking oil on public asphalt. It wasn't. It was fully serviced, weekly. And, most ridiculously, that I was housing unauthorized livestock. Livestock. Melissa burst out laughing when she read that one. "Do they mean Daisy?" she asked, pointing to our 14-pound bulldog snoring on the couch, "because she's the only creature I feed twice a day around here." It would have been funny if it wasn't all part of a smear campaign. Karen wasn't just trying to push back. She was trying to make me the villain of the entire neighborhood. With Ronald gone, she was stepping out of the shadows. And worse, she was trying to rally support to reinstate the old board with herself. As the new president, flyers started showing up on doorsteps, the kind printed at home, designed with flashy fonts and dramatic wording. "Take back our community, protect our standards from abuse of power, reinstate the HOA, and restore order." I found one taped to my mailbox. That was it. I was done playing defense. I started attending the weekly community gatherings that had sprung up after the board's removal. People had begun meeting in the park, talking about how to keep things fair, how to build a better system. I told them the truth about the complaints, the lies, the anonymous reports. I didn't rant or posture. I just laid out the facts. And then I showed them something no flyer could match. Proof. I printed out the IA review report, unfounded. I brought the city's inspection forms, no violations. I even brought in body cam footage from the original driveway incident, showing me calmly warning the impersonators, giving them legal grounds to leave. I wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. I was proving I wasn't the problem. Karen was. One neighbor after another started coming forward with their own stories about Karen sending passive-aggressive notes, about fines mysteriously doubling, about being called unfit for the community for things like mismatched patio chairs or letting kids play with sidewalk chalk. The final straw came from a single dad named Marcus who'd recently moved in with his daughter. Karen had threatened to report him to CPS because his front yard looked unsafe for children. He choked up while telling us, said it made his daughter cry, said it almost made him move. The park went silent. That night I met with Lisa, again my attorney friend. We filed a restraining order against Karen on behalf of Marcus and submitted formal harassment claims to the city's community board. Also flagged her for false reporting through the state's civic abuse registry. That didn't stop there. The new interim committee, made up of level-headed residents, agreed to review Karen's behavior during the previous board's rule changes. What they found was damning. She'd drafted at least 6 amendments to the HOA charter, none of which had ever been voted on. Some were backdated, a few were missing signatures altogether. She'd been running a shadow board the entire time. When the truth hit, it hit hard. Karen was called into a public review meeting, and this time, the room was full. Standing room only. Not even Ronald showed up to defend her. I didn't need to say much. I watched from the back, arms folded, as Karen tried to spin her narrative. "I was only trying to maintain standards," she shouted, but no one cheered. Someone asked, "You mean the standards that let you find old ladies and block people's driveways?" She sputtered, but the damage was done in a near-unanimous vote. Karen was permanently banned from holding any position in the neighborhood's management. She was also served with a formal cease and desist for harassment. Her influence evaporated overnight, and just like that, the queen fell that week. The community felt lighter. Children played in driveways again. Neighbors talked without fear of being reported. People decorated their porches, painted their doors, waved when they saw me walking Daisy. Real change had taken root not through rage or revenge, but through truth, law, and unity. Melissa and I hosted a small barbecue to celebrate. Nothing big, just a few neighbors, burgers on the grill, music in the background. One of the older residents raised a toast and said, "To Chief Cole, not just the guy who protects our city but the one who saved our street." I'm not one for praise, but in that moment, standing in my backyard with laughter around me and the smell of fresh charcoal in the air, I felt it deeply. This place was finally becoming what we wanted when we moved in, home. And as for the $79 fine that started it all, still framed, still hanging, still the best investment I ever made. Ronald's arrogance didn't end with his public embarrassment. Even after his fake enforcers were cited and the neighborhood was buzzing with outrage, he still walked around the HOA office like he was untouchable. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was delusion. Either way, he wasn't ready for what was coming next. I had spent 2 weeks collecting every document, complaint, and video clip that tied the HOA to harassment, impersonation, and the misuse of power. What started as a personal attack over a $79 aesthetic violation had blown wide open into a full-blown community uprising, but it wasn't enough to just scare them. I wanted it shut down. Permanently. One Saturday morning, I arranged a closed-door meeting with our city attorney, the mayor, and the Department of Consumer Affairs. I presented everything: the fake badges, the roadblock, the intimidation tactics, the fines without legal standing. But what tipped it over the edge was the testimony of a disabled veteran, James, who had been fined $200 for having a wheelchair ramp without design approval. When I played the audio recording of Ronald saying, "You're not above the HOA just because you've got wheels," the entire room went silent. The mayor's jaw clenched. "We'll handle this." The city immediately suspended the HOA authority pending investigation. But I wasn't finished. With support from our legal team, I filed a formal petition to dissolve the HOA altogether. The neighborhood had spoken. Over 75% of homeowners had signed a petition agreeing the board had abused their power. Normally, disbanding an HOA is a long and painful legal process, but with overwhelming evidence and public backing, the court granted an emergency injunction. 2 days later, I walked past the HOA office and saw city workers removing the sign from the building. Ronald wasn't there. He'd gone radio silent. His social media accounts were scrubbed. His fancy SUV hadn't moved in days, and neighbors whispered about him planning to sell his house. The king of community control had vanished. That same evening, I organized a town hall in the community center, the first meeting in years not hosted or monitored by the HOA. Hundreds of people showed up. Some brought their kids. Some brought notes. All of them brought stories. An elderly woman stood up and shared how she was fined every week for her unapproved rose bushes that her late husband had planted 30 years ago. A young mother described how they were cited for unauthorized child activity because her kids had drawn hopscotch on the sidewalk. One man choked up as he explained how the board threatened to sue him over pet noise from his therapy dog. Every story added weight to the truth. This wasn't just about rules. It was about control. After everyone had spoken, I took the stage. "From this point on, your rights belong to you again," I said. "There will be no more threats, no more fake cops, and no more fines for living your life." The crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't just relief. It was the sound of people reclaiming their freedom. And right there, in that moment, I felt something shift. I wasn't just their neighbor anymore. I had become something else, a guardian of the peace they thought was lost. We voted to form a new neighborhood council, fully transparent, voluntary, and advisory only. No fines, no forced fees, no made-up codes. Just people helping people. And you know what happened after that? The community came alive. Lawns got greener, sidewalks filled with chalk drawings again. Kids laughed, grown-ups smiled. A group of teens even volunteered to repaint the community center, free of charge. It turns out when people aren't being harassed, they give more than you expect. A few weeks later, as I was walking my dog, I saw a moving truck outside Ronald's house. He was standing by the back, avoiding eye contact, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I didn't say a word, just tipped my hat and kept walking. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. He already knew he'd lost everything, not just his title, but the power he built on fear. That power was gone, and it wasn't coming back. In the following months, several legal investigations were launched into how funds were collected and spent by the HOA during Ronald's leadership. One of the fake enforcers took a plea deal in exchange for testifying that Ronald had instructed them to impersonate officers, fully knowing it was illegal. That was enough for a criminal charge. Ronald was eventually arrested for conspiracy, fraud, and impersonation. When the verdict came in, the whole neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. Justice wasn't just done, it was seen. Meanwhile, I returned to my regular duties at the department. But every now and then, someone from the neighborhood would stop by the station to thank me. Some brought coffee. Others just smiled and waved. The $79 ticket that started it all, I kept it, framed it, hung it up on the wall in my office right beside my badge. A reminder that sometimes the biggest fights come in the smallest packages. You'd think the story ends there, but really, that's where it began. We didn't just remove a bad board. We rebuilt trust. We restored kindness. We reminded ourselves that rules aren't made to break people down, they're meant to lift us up. And now we live that truth every single day. The HOA cops thought they could block my driveway and my life over $79, but they didn't realize the driveway belonged to the chief of police, and the neighborhood belonged to the people. If you loved this real justice story, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Subscribe to Bright Reality for more jaw-dropping HOA stories and real-life drama that hits back.